So I have a really great topic to talk about today, parenting, and I think everybody in the room is therapists. Do I have any parents in the room that are here for that purpose versus therapy therapists? There's a CU credit for this hour, so I've presumed we'd all be therapists. So cool. But I want you to think about why you're here. So purposefully, what we can get out of this time in this short hour. It's a pretty robust topic to think about and to work on and to think about through the lens of how we can address these issues to our clients, the families that are working in and around it, and inclusive with gay children, as well as gay and transgender progression of what's happening in our world, right? And then I also want you to think real quick on what's your comfort level with this topic. So as professional clinicians, I want you to think about this. If somebody came to you with this need or something around the gay queer world, what would your comfort be? So the reason I had you get the paper out is on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being super comfortable with the topic, 1 being novice, give yourself a score. And after we're done, I want to come back and maybe look at that again. I got a bunch of cool objectives. Like I said, it's going to be a lot to go through. I want to go through history. I want to do some definitions, look at some demographics, think about the knowledge we can gain to understand the population better, terminology, et cetera, as well as thinking about what happens as a parent is learning about, especially in our faith-based communities, gay children or gay questioning children or gender questioning children and how they would manage that and how we would help them. And obviously learning to support them and look at our own biases and dissonance. In the context of the topic, it's important that you guys know that I prepared this for the masses. This is not a micro, laser-focused, faith-based presentation that I'm going to give you. This is a clinician presentation that I'm going to give you. And so it has broad perspective and information. A lot of the other holes we can be maybe discussing or filling in later. I have tons of resources up here if you guys want to check them out on the full range of accepting, non-accepting, and in between in the Christian community, as well as in the professional community. And hopefully everybody will interact with me a little bit. We want to be free of judgment or shame, so hopefully everybody feels safe emotionally in this space so they can share honestly their experiences so we can all grow together. Everybody okay with that? And in this final statement, just understanding as us as gatekeepers to create healing, how important that role is as we're working with our families and our communities that are battling whatever the issue is. So I want you to, fortunately, I was thinking mostly you guys would be clinicians. Here's some things I want you to think about. What's your current awareness on this topic? Do you have conflict of interest on this topic if you're having an extreme bias or if you have personal context in your life that prevents you from being objectively supportive to clients that may be presenting with this issue as a parent or as a child or a kid? What's that about for you? Do you have your own covert bias from a lot of things that we'll dig into later, which would be maybe those subconscious things that sometimes creep up on us in practice? Everybody's familiar with the countertransference term in this room, correct? What's crazy is, of course, when we say we don't have countertransference, that means we have it, right? So we want to just be savvy to that reality, and when we unpeel the onion and we look at where we're working with folks in sensitive zones, if that's the case for us, then we want to be honest about it and be aware so that we can be more mature in the pocket of what we're doing with our clients. Also, consciously be aware of what your hidden wounds are. We're talking about sex. Sex is a really volatile area with percentages of 40 to 60% of all kids in our generation, which would be, I'm a boomer, so that's not exactly right, XYZ, XY millennials probably in the room. Any Zs, 26 and under? Awesome. 40 to 60% with inappropriate sexual touch as a child. If those wounds are still raw, soft, et cetera, have been addressed clinically as you're approaching these topics, then we can be very vulnerable and then not be in the most effective place to help our clients. And I want you to also think about this term that I invented, creating a corrective experience expectation. Sometimes from the broader spiritual sense, we have these experiences as we're working with clients that help us actually heal in the right place for the right motivation, which is a very powerful thing. If you've worked with clients and you've experienced something like that in a therapeutic alliance, it's a beautiful thing. All right, so how many of you are very familiar with all the gender, transgender, sexual identity terminology things? How many of you would you say you're expert? How many of you are like a novice? How many of you are like in the middle of the road? All right, so this graphic is a good one to kind of look at what's going on as I work in and around gender identity, gender expression, sex identity, physical attraction, emotional attraction. These are all separate things to that community. But the gender unicorn kind of helps us understand. I want you to see it as a multi-dimensional experience for the kid or the adult that's representing or presenting as gender specific in a non-normative way. So their identity is basically what they perceive themselves as physically. Then there's the gender expression, how they're showing it to the world. The sex assigned at birth, which isn't always binary. Sometimes we have scenarios where people are intersexed at birth. Everybody remembers that from parts of our grad school, I'm sure. And then who they're physically attracted to, i.e. what the body does sexually responsively to others around them. And then who they're emotionally attracted to, which is who they maybe feel emotionally safe with, versus a sexual attraction per se. Any of that new to anybody? If we think about this universal five-dimensional progression, which helps, the better we understand this, the better we can help our families. Because just like in many areas we work, these things are so esoteric. A client comes to you and they say, oh, you're the psychiatrist, right? You can give me the medication. You know, the different layers of who we are, what we do in mental health are very confusing to our folks. So the better we understand it, the better we can help them. This graphic is similar and helps visually present it a little bit. What is the way we would present or what our orientation is and our expression connected to or not connected to with biology as well. Basically an echo of the prior slide in a different way. A common term for those that are presenting is the standard sexual presentation plus attraction would be cisgender. Have you guys heard of that term before? What are some other words that may describe the general lexicon of the queer nation? Non-binary, which would mean kind of what?
That they don't fall into the area of male or female, or they identify with both.
Very good. What are some other ones? What's transgender mean? Somebody that has a physical body that's different than how they perceive their emotional person sexually.
Them.
Pardon?
Is it them?
Well, the pronouns are often very important to them, and we'll talk about that at a certain point as we're working with folks. Lesbian, female sexual attraction. Homosexual, general sexual attraction to others. Gender nonconforming, presenting in a different way. And those that are asexual, that don't perceive any sexual need, as well as agender, they're neutral. If you don't know these terms and a family approaches you, there could be a lot of confusion. Or if you're working with these kids, it's really important from a cultural sensitivity standpoint that you understand their world, or adults that are presenting as such. Depending on the expertise of the clinician, it can really diffuse a lot of defenses and allow for an opening for really good healing, whichever way their need is met. Now, why do we need to worry about them? Because they're a larger percentage of the population, and more those of us that are working in the field as well as our families are affected in a different way. If I grew up traditional, hetero upbringing in a traditional structure, say a legalistic church environment, and I have a kid presenting this way, I need to think about it. The stats vary between 22 to 28% of Gen Z presenting as queer nation. That means gay per se, or 17% of those present as what we would call bisexual. They're open to it, but only about 11% of all of those are out of the closet. In and around that, millennial and forward, is a lot lower percentage of the population, but in the United States, approximately 7.2% of the population presents that way, or 1.3 million young adults that present as transgender and so forth. The research shows that transgender individuals are younger on average than the US population. We find that youth ages 13 to 17 are significantly more likely to identify as transgender than adults ages 65 or older. And depending on racial and ethnic distribution, those numbers could be much higher. Further data shows that the trans people represent, in the context of if they're presenting as trans, non-binary are 40%, trans women are 22%, transgender non-conforming 22%, and trans men 12%, and some the other way. What I also want to emphasize is the risk factors and the vulnerability of this population, and this slide presents a few things. The queer youth have 4 times higher risk for suicide attempt. 39% of LGBTQ plus young people considered suicide in the past year. That's almost 40%, including 46% of the transgender, non-binary young people. Now, is adolescence difficult now, whether you have this issue or not? Absolutely. Any of you work with teenagers, you know they have the lowest frustration tolerance in the world with 100% of all the data in front of them at the same time without the wisdom to put together to figure out a way through it some of the times. You add mental illness, you add family dysfunction, upwards of 60% of our families are single parent, etc., and the rest speaks for itself. Then you have this unique issue where the individual knows that they don't fit into the world and may or may not be accepted by those that love them or presumably would love them in their family. And it can be a very confusing state. We add social media impact and the bullying progression, and we have a very vulnerable population that we want to be really careful with when we're working in and around what's going on with them. Suicide risk safety planning is really common with some of our high at-risk emotionally mental ill kids, and we would want to presumably approach these kids with a similar lens. I have one I'm working with right now. She's in my office, and she's often decompensating to the point in my office, because that's the one safe place where she's on the floor crying with the dog for half the session. That's just her world. When she's in the other places, she's got to have the mask on and she can't be authentic. And then that reality with rejection of her parents, etc., she's been Baker Acted 3 times in the last 2 years. And it goes without saying that the percentage of mental illness identified characteristics like anxiety is 66%, depression is 53%, and then 40% of the homeless youth are identified as LGBT. So what do they face in society? 10% are threatened or injured with a weapon on school property, 34% were bullied in school property, 28% experienced cyberbullying regularly, 23% had dated someone during the 12 months prior to the survey that had experienced sexual dating violence, 18% of the students had experienced physical dating violence, another 18% had been forced to have sexual intercourse at some point in their lives. Sexual trauma, obviously very common in the exposure of sex to our kids in this generation with the internet is staggering in its first place. But the bullying progression is something that I will call death by 1,000 cuts. Their sense of guarded nature is built up over hearing queer jokes, queer slang jokes, etc. How many times a day you want to guess that the average is that they say they hear them at school?
20 to 30.
15 to 20 times a day. Amongst heterosexual kids using the terminology to cut each other down as a common tool for adolescent veracity and bravado. Substance use has increased in this population over the standard population with the 47% alcohol use, which increases the suicide risk or suicide attempt risk by 50% over that other one that we already shown for 40%. 29% that abuse marijuana, again, it doubles the risk for suicide, and those that are abusing prescription drugs triples the increased risk for suicide. So no outlet, we have an addiction-based culture, They're easy access to any drug for $20 in our culture. If all of you work with teens, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And then the toxicity and the proportion of the drugs continues to go higher. THC on the street has a 30% level now. Old weed on the street maybe had a 2-3% THC level in it. It's the same across the board for all the drugs. We don't have to talk too much about the opioid crisis and what's going on with fentanyl. All that's in the mix for them. All right, so then let's transition with all the heavy kind of stuff to what is our job as a parent? Don't look at the words yet. Just think about that for a second. How many of you are parents? Anybody like a step parent that didn't identify there as a parent? Anybody want to be a parent that's not a parent? So as a parent, how difficult it is being a parent? This quote is awesome. I don't know about you, but somebody played a terrible trick on me. Someone just gave me this kid with no instructions. I'll never forget having them hand me that first baby and thinking, now what do I do? When I'm working with restorative justice concepts with teenagers and the issue with promiscuity, one of the things I always illustrate with them is the reality of a mom having a baby physiologically. And then this life that's going to impact them in a way that's going to create sleep deprivation for 2 to 8 years, if not the rest of their life. And then in many cases, of course, if you're breastfeeding, they're fully dependent on them for sustenance as well. And what that does. So then we add all these interesting variables. I lost my mic, I think. All right, so we want to, as a parent, we want to be protecting our children, provide basic needs, give them some sense of values orientation, an understanding of the world and purpose, create individuals that can launch into the world and be contributors to society. That's our job, right? Did I leave anything out there? The broader sense of parenthood is a heavy burden. And then, so how do we do this with this unique population, and how do we not lose sight of it? That slide might be out of order. Oh, no, okay. So I just want you to pause and think about that. So as we're working with families, sometimes it's like, okay, what's the need? What's in front of us? What's the treatment plan say? Versus this much bigger approach in helping them see what's going on. We often have parents now that are trying to be their child's friend all the time. And, or that just to do whatever to keep them quiet so they can live their life the way they want to live their life, which translates to kids with no frustration tolerance, with an inability to manage stress. And as you guys are doing the book study recently, Ross was telling me on these kids that are overexposed digitally to a place where the neuroses is so high because they have no capacity to manage it. A horrible concoction. Enough said about that. So now I want to think about, okay, so we got a queer kid. My family's coming to you with a queer child, whatever it is presenting. There's a lot of variables, whether it was a surprise, what age they are, et cetera. But one of the things we got to think about in strength-based thinking is what else defines that kid? It's a fixating point because it's such a unique differential from society, and depending on the family and their expectation of what the child would be and their needs and their expectations for how they would have presupposed the definition. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the gap discussion, depending on time. But there's so many other things that define a kid. There's an intersectionality image here that helps break it down a little bit. Yes, they're complex, they're multidimensional, but there's so many other things that would define a child besides their gender identity or their sexual preference. To get our families to find purpose in that helps deflect a bit from some of the crisis if they're not accepting or if they're having trauma, understandably sometimes from their perspective that would lead to them being unhealthy in the interactions with the child, depending on when the child comes out and what might be going on in their world. Have you guys seen this graphic before? If you would think about it coming out of the screen and making it multidimensional, that would be a bit more accurate. This is, of course, a two-dimensional image. But what else would define our kids? What other categories could we describe them? Intellectually gifted, artistically gifted, athletically, creative, caring, courageous. Oh, they're queer too, okay. But We could get fixated on the one place without really seeing the wholeness of the child. And in the worst rejection, they would be perceived only as that thing, and that becomes a lightning bolt moment for conflict. What do you think happens then if a parent tries to address it in a demonstrative, authoritarian way? That's all the child receives, and it's an echo of what they're receiving potentially from the world, which is rejection and lack of acceptance or lack of the true love. So the other thing to think about is whatever we're doing with the family, understanding where this kid is developmentally. Ericksonian developmental stages, what's the primary crisis in adolescence? Who remembers? Griselle, help me out. Adolescent crisis, identity versus confusion or inferiority. So it's of course the period of life where kids are questioning all these things. Now, one of the pause points for us is to help families see that this is an arc of a journey, not always a destination. Some of you may have heard the term gay for this day. They like to experiment, do whatever. It just doesn't mean necessarily it's a full-time identification sexually, or that's just one thing girls do in college, and they move on to whatever. To help families understand, sometimes we're working with them, that's a part of the process, and different than the others that are fully identifying. But in the place of adolescence, in this culture, it's a different world because of the access to all the information of all time right here with zero depth of wisdom connected to it. And then you add the layering of what social media does to craft and manipulate for likes and hits and sometimes money, YouTube, and if you guys know about the YouTube culture and all those guys that make all that money. You guys know what Twitch is? Twitch is a app where people pay to watch other people play other video games that they like so they can pick up tricks on how to play. And they're pure celebrities in that culture. They win the international Fortnite competitions, and all of a sudden, $10,000 a month or more on YouTube, having fun, or Twitch. Just to give you a microcosm of what's going on in their culture. What other stuff about adolescence? So we also want to remember where our kids are physiologically developing and where they are emotionally developing. Lots of premature, precocious adolescence and puberty happening right now with whatever's going on in the hormonated milk, or I don't know. I had an 11-year-old in my office the other day, thick as a man. And it was funny because I seen the dad twice and was helping him with some other things, and then he explained to me how much havoc this son is creating over his 3 siblings. And I was like, he's 11-year-old. How could you not have, my preconceived notion and bias. And he comes in the room. How you doing, Mr. Thompson? Like, for real. Now, he didn't present like as aggressive to me. It was just like, this is a grown little man. At 11. Now, girls for a long time have had the earlier, obviously, progression of menses and so forth. But we want to think about where they are physically and the disconnect from where they are emotionally, but yet the way the world perceives them. Worked with a client over the years that was a Goliath. And the kid was 16. So the world saw him as 25, but he was also an emotive Goliath. And so people were very confused because he was very dissonant and emotionally dysregulated consistently, no matter what environment he was in such a beautiful, gentle way. If you saw him as that 16-year-old that's still growing up from his 12-year-old or 10-year-old self, where he felt safe, like in a really cool little emotional place. What could be some other discrepancies? What do you think that might affect where they are in adolescence? Think about socioeconomic. Think about cultural reference, church connection, what type of church progression they've been through, their general individual relationship with God, what that means to them, because there's a whole lot of confusion there if they're anchored solid there with what's going on with messaging and what they're experiencing physiologically. And of course, defining themselves. It's not uncommon. Kids that grow up in church and adolescents start to reject God for a while and then circle back eventually, and hopefully ground further in their spiritual sense. This later adolescent, we're developing pride, we're developing purpose, we're developing understanding of who we are. All this affects what happens when they're disclosing or figuring out where they are sexually. So now what? Find out, or I hear, or my child comes out to me. Who am I as the parent? What's my job? And what do I do? And do me and my spouse, if there's a spouse in the room or in the house, or another step or significant other, in agreement on how to respond to it? And do I have a window where I have an opportunity to really lift up a life or crush a life in a way that may stifle connection forever? Woo, heavy duty stuff. As a parent presenting to you this issue, it's really important that you help navigate that with them and what it is. Most times, if parents are presenting for therapy in the crisis space of this, who's had this kind of client before? Anybody? So some of you have worked with it. There's a true crisis for them too. We certainly want to honor that. But our coaching to them can really help stabilize, but there's a progression of what they have to do. When a kid presents to a parent that's not expecting, they have to grieve the loss of the expected child. Do we not, all of our of you that are in the room that are parents, do we not anchor on our kids in a vicarious way with expectations that often translate to pride and great sense of accomplishment? But this thing is disconnected from what that is. So the first piece to help the parents is just really work with them on the grief cycle if that's where they are. Now, if they're in an accepting space, a whole different ball game, but there's still some parameters that maybe we should be talking about. Safe sex coaching and understanding of where they are in behavior and whatever else is going on. And obviously we all in the room should know the stages of grief. But the trick is it's not linear. And if somebody's fixated at a certain grief stage, it can block a whole lot of stuff. It can sabotage the marriage. It can disrupt the other kids that they're parenting. All these other things can be launched. And there's a whole lot of other people in the pot that may be influencing the peers, other people's parents, teachers, coaches, whoever, that see the child as the broader pieces, all the interconnected pieces versus this one piece that is the shocker to the family. So a concept I want to present is this expectations versus reality gap in a normative child versus an LGBT child. So the way I kind of think about this like on a Likert scale. If somebody's totally non-accepting and their kid comes out, that's a huge gap. If somebody's sort of in the middle and struggling but has some other questions, that's not such a big gap. One of the ways for us to assess what to do with our parents or families that we're working with in this arena, if we're doing it, is to think about what that gap is and help them see it and what the discrepancy is. Now, we're not telling anybody how to raise their kids, but we're really trying to help them navigate this if they're our client. And that's one area where they can potentially get some better understanding to mollify some of the reaction pattern if it's an extreme reaction pattern, or to understand better their job as the parent first versus their emotional need. And you as the clinician be conscious of where you are values and otherwise with it as well, so you can see if there's a big gap too. If there is a big gap, we got a problem probably. And understanding the gap disparity really helps us really move forward. But there's all these other things, like I wrote these notes about, besides LGBTQ, the generational differences. I have a whole other training on the generations and Gen Z and the workforce and the millennials, and all you millennials get also beat up for wanting a trophy and all that stuff all the time, right? A little pat on the back. But everybody's an individual, right? So Gen Z, though, is a little different. Gen Z is a bit more about, hey, I'd still want to change the world, I just don't know how to yet. They're not the digital natives like Alpha, which are the kids under like 12, who are not sure what they want to do. They just want to play video games all the time and be brainwashed by Bluey. But also the issue is, what is the parents' childhood wounds that they carry into parenting? I know for me, I had a subconscious desire, intent, expectation that I would get corrective emotional healing through raising my children. And it didn't really come to me till much later on in my parenting to be objectively aware of it. And we can pull those layers out for some of these parents. Potentially, maybe it will help with the process of them accepting or addressing what's going on and to factor in the level of the values that they have in their family and who they are. And when that happens in a good way, it's super home run. My parents got divorced at 7. I remember getting my son to 7 and having this cathartic experience. Like, yeah, we got through this window with a successful family. Like, I can reconstitute the destruction of what happened in the worst scenario of my family by experiencing this healing in my family. Of course, no family's perfect, and of course, I'm on 35 years by the grace of God this last year. Ross has still got me by 2, right? 36 years, or 37 for you guys.
Marriage?
Yeah. You forgot, didn't you?
When did you had kids first?
Yeah. The first grandchild of 6 generations, whatever. But Ross is going to have the first grandchild, which is really cool. Great grandchild. Which, great, right? Yeah. Oh, that's really cool.
Not my great.
We're too young. You know how you guys, some of you older guys, you get it. You're still like, whatever, 30 in your head, or 12 sometimes if you're a guy, but so you don't think about these things. So then also we want to be, at that point, thinking about with these parents how to get them through the grief process, initiation, moving through the shock, and figuring out ways to integrate whatever's going on, because there's a whole lot of other multidimensional variables. So other factors, I was thinking about this too, like what's going on with the rest of the family? What's the family constitution? Is it a blended family? Are there other kids? Where are the siblings in developmental progression? Often, Queer Nation kids are very expressive and emotive, and they suck a lot of air out of the room of a family. And so the other kids kind of get like, sometimes that's a win or a bonus, but sometimes there's a fallout or a hangover from that. And so we want to help families not lose sight of that too if that occurs. I can't read those slides very well. Thinking about intellectual differences, social media involvement, engagement. Let's say you have kids that are involved with social media at a high level. Anybody have kids that are involved with their influencers, for example? Or aware, like there's a whole lot of different things that go on that could affect potentially what would be the multiple dimensions of what's happening in this family. Thinking about surrogate parent influence. If you aren't providing safe, unconditional love, or if the family isn't, they will find unconditional love people. If it's a teacher, a coach, somebody else that they feel safe with, somebody through the specific gay community, or others sometimes not. And that's not always bad, but it certainly is a secondary fear for a parent than to lose control if they're wired that way and not trusting the world, because many times those influences may or may not be healthy. Let's say they're open to promiscuity, for example, and that's not a value that the family would present, then that may be a big conflict. The temperament of the LGBT youth. What if they're a strong-willed child also? What if they're a lost sheep and they're super passive and quiet? All those things may affect how we might approach working with the families and with the youth if they're in front of us. The initial age of impression. 16-year-old comes out as queer. The parents are like, oh, he's been kind of wanting to be in ballet since he was 5, the musical theater. Well, duh, there were all the hints there. Versus a kid that's normative presenting sexually comes out as gay. You guys know what bears are? Bears are super masculine, hairy gay guys. They're in the gym and the weight room. You were surprised I knew that term? The millennials are like, this guy. And that being aware of what that is. So the other piece I was thinking about was the overall root parenting strategy. Do the families we work with have really good grounded parenting strategies sometimes? Maybe 20%, They read some Dobson thing, or they're into Adlerian social learning theory, and they're super good with family meetings, or sometimes it's like, first child, we're going to raise them like that. We're just going to be mean as heck. Second child, oh, they can do whatever they want. They're creative, and blah, blah, blah. Third child, lock it back down. The second one got in so much trouble, we got to trap them again. I don't know. Being conscious of that as well. Age of coming out or when they're outed. So we have so much now where kids are being sexually active at premature ages because the hyper pornography exposure and technology exposure. So kids peer acting out at 12, boy to boy, is a whole lot different than queer identifying. because that's the presumable group that they would be playing with, it would make sense that maybe that would be the target for their exploration when they can't have appropriate relationships with a different gender or a girl. Do you guys seeing that like I'm seeing that? Much more just in their face sexually. And as you know, there's no filter on the internet. And these kids aren't, even if you have everything in your house, they're at their buddy's house hooking onto their Wi-Fi, or they're at the end of football practice or whatever, a sports something, and somebody pulls out a phone and hooks onto the public Wi-Fi. And next thing you know, they're being exposed to extreme BDM sex or something, bestiality, everything. There's just no filter. What do you think that does, especially to visual males, when they're exposed pre-adolescence? Boom, that light switch goes on. I had clients that would talk to me about masturbation since they were 5 or 6 because they were early exposed even before they could have a sexual response. It's not that uncommon anymore, sadly. Community confusion, so they present a certain way to the community and they present differently at home. The community sees them as all those matrix of things, like we shared before, not this queer kid or this kid that's LGBT, transgender. Transgender is a whole different deal, obviously, they start to dress differently. But they may present differently in different subsets. They're okay on the sports team because they're good at being a jock. They're not necessarily presenting as queer, say it's a male, in that environment. But then in their social context, when they're with those folks that are accepting, that's how they present. And as we know, adolescents experiment a ton, so this is this fluid thing that's happening. Guilt, shame, and fear. The emotions for the individual that's presenting and the emotion for the parent. We got to get past shame quick. Fear of judgment as best we can. As Albert Ellis would say, we're all fallible human beings with another F in front of it. And if we can really embrace that as our humans in the flesh from our faith-based standpoint, we can then manage it better, we can be in control better instead of the shame blocking us, seeking help, getting support systems, all these other things that can help us. Now, there is, of course, appropriate shame that would inhibit inappropriate behavior in public or something, but this is the shame that's the toxic shame. And the guilt or the fear, I failed as a parent maybe, or whatever that might be. The dissonance of the discrepancy is so huge that I'm just so confused about what that means. And if you're, many of us coming from older cultures with older levels of acceptance or understanding of queer culture, then that really means some heavy stuff to it. We want to help them manage that. Can you guys think of any other factors?
I'm just thinking of birth order.
Yeah.
They're the firstborn, secondborn.
Yeah, there's interesting data about that. The one I don't know, because I've not experienced this in my clinical practice, where the more boys you have, the youngest one has much higher percentage, like 4 times more percent of being gay. In grad school, I remember the data showed that the hardest male adjustment in a cis-normative family is if the oldest is a daughter that's achieving, and then the son is within 3 years or less behind the daughter. That's the biggest difficulty to manage identity, whatever that is. Do you guys remember some of that? Does it stick out to you at all, Ross? You know, this played out in my family for sure, with my kids.
Cultural background.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put it that way.
Beautiful. So Indian culture versus American culture versus those of color, and being conscious of what that is. Native American culture, Hispanic culture. We have Haitian culture in Florida that's pretty predominant. And then there's a whole other discussion about what the subset of culture would be in terms of accepting it, not looking at it, accepting it without owning it, all these different things. How do we learn best about our clients' culture? We ask them. Help me understand that. Tell me a little bit more about it. Let's unravel that more. You know, what are some other cool phrases to pull things out of people? Anybody else think of anything? Deconstruct that for me a little bit more. I want to burrow down on that one for a second. All right, so if we're an accepting parent culture, we want to really work with advocating the kid for the child, supporting diverse friendships, provide exposure to people working with other activities that are conventional gender, outside of gender expectations, and engage in conversations with our children. This is like the template for what we would say would be the societal neutral response to provide a safe experience for the child. Even if you're not fully accepting, there's ways to be aware of the specific culture that can be helpful. Inviting their queer friends over and having them at your house. Seeing them interact as humans, not sexual targets for each other. Helping the child see that it's okay for you to have rules and be a parent in the authoritative space as it's appropriate many times, but also kind of being conscious of what the world is that they flow in, because the highest influence of children is their parents up to pre-adolescence, and then it's peers, as we know. So what's going to happen if we just totally truncate their exposure to peers or their capacity to connect with peers? They're going to rebel more, right? Now, this doesn't mean having crazy parties at your house. It's just like there's ways to reconnect or encourage them to connect. Get to groups like PFLAG, and also Parents and Friends of Lesbian and Gays is very healthy for families that are not sure where they are on understanding. And from my understanding, our local groups are super good about not judging people either, regardless of where they are in accepting or not accepting. I don't know of any subset clinical groups that we have around that specifically address this. Sarasota is very gay positive in many ways, and so I'm sure there's some other areas. We have a couple specific churches that are accepting, that may have folks that could be open to it, and encouraging and supporting people as they're trying to figure out this process on their journey. So the other healthy support ideas include thinking about a neutral response or an affirming response if they disclose. I've never seen a person or heard a story of a person that's surprised that's able to do this. Even though there's plenty of videos on the internet, I didn't want to run any videos because of the complications of the technology today, but where parents are responsive in a way that's healing. Accept and love the child in general, and understand that they are a breathing human that has this experience that they're dealing with. Often I'll talk to parents if I have this scenario come up, and I'll say, so how do you identify? And most cases they're hetero, right? And then I say to them, well, I want you to be gay now. Don't be hetero. And of course they look at me with cross eyes because they fully identify physiologically and sexual attraction that way. If you're gender normative and I say, let's dress up like a man today, that's so dissident from what their reality would be, right? But it gives them a pause to think about if their child is identifying, depending on the age, of course, and where they are in their growth, developmental stages, et cetera, to maybe think about how hard their child's perception would be if we're asking them to change. Gender reassignment therapy and all that stuff's all debunked by research. It's very clear. Anybody that went through those programs, in 90% felt traumatized by those programs. I forget the one big group that used to do a residential program for, you would go and they would determine after your first 30 days how long they keep you. And some of them stayed 3, 5, 6 years and lost the sense of self in the world, often. Now, not always. There's others that it's so dissonant from their faith connection that there really is a lot of motivation to sort out what's going on sexually with them. And there are some very receptive folks that would be potentially very helpful. But the world is complicated. I worked with a client in his adulthood who was married to another man. And it just destroyed him to break this marriage up. But his beliefs were grounded and founded in the dysfunction of what he thought it was based on his teaching and what he believed in. But to watch him go through that was so hard. So thinking about danger signs, anything related to a negative reaction translates to increased suicide risk, increased emotional conversion to other folks and influences, but try to also then think about these other ways that we can support, at least in the middle. Research, getting in and around other groups that are educational and encouraging the families to do that, and thinking about diversity in the broader sense of it, not just those that are queer, LGBTQ+, but also race, all types of different things from cultural standpoints, et cetera. Part of our childhood in LA was pretty fascinating. Ross and I got to go to Alvaro Street in the center of the Mexican community in LA. And I always remember, man, how cool we got to get exposed to so many cool cultures. We lived in an area called Inglewood, which is really close to Watts and Compton, if you know those areas in Los Angeles, they're fraught with gang violence. But there's this thing called the Watts Towers in the middle of LA where this guy said, I'm gonna take a bunch of junk and build these cool towers that are, in my child's mind, was better than the Eiffel Tower. It was these pretty amazing structures. When we open up our mind to some of those senses of connecting with culture, there's so much more of the broader intersectionality of who an individual is, and then finding ways to support that, whatever that is. If it's Broadway shows, or if it's athletic events, if it's monster truck experiences, if it's building things, the Saturday morning workshops at Home Depot or Lego World, which, how many of you got Lego kids? Future engineers, how expensive are those things, right? I had this cute little neighbor move in. His dad was deployed in the military. I'm like, hey, Connor, I'm going to do a Lego thing with you. You pick one out and send it to me on Amazon. He sent me like a $400 Egyptian head. I was like, hey, Connor, I don't know if we can do that now. Maybe you just give that one to your dad. Now, depending on temperament, the parent may receive the child's out behavior as aggressive. What do you think that would look like? Because there's such a dissonance, the rebellion comes out not physically aggressive, but overtly queer or overtly feminine if it's a gay male, for example. Just to let the freak flag fly, because that's the only power the kid has against the parent. It's a fascinating dynamic to watch come out. How many times can you watch a chaperone video repeated? You guys know who that is? It's a crazy artist that's all high-pitched singing and whatever. Or what's the other one? She calls her people the monsters, my little monsters. Huh? Lady Gaga. Yeah. Who'd you think, Griselle?
I said Lady Gaga.
Oh, you got it? Yeah. All right. All right, back to our fundamentals. Let them know they're loved, encourage dialogue, stay involved in school processes, look out for signs of bullying. One of our key canons as a parent, now to a person, whether you're comfortable with your kid being different or not, is to protect your kids. And there's a lot of layers in that. Like, okay, you're a gay male adolescent and you're horny all the time. I'm a parent. I want to try to figure out a way to have you have at least safe sex if you're going to have sex. Am I worried about HIV? Am I worried about, oh, heck yeah. As we know, adolescents are all acceleration, no brakes. The internet culture drives that even further to beyond normal progression of expression of behaviors. So whatever I can do to get around that, that's important to encourage the families. Take a team approach. Hey, hopefully the peer parent is in allegiance with you. A grandparent sometimes can tie into that. Encourage these healthy relationships and watch social media stuff. And think about the facts. Is it a phase? Is it not a phase? Is there a cure? Is there not a cure? But don't look for blame. Look for stabilization. So other resiliency factors, if you're parenting or working with parents that are addressing this, thinking about a healthy physician relationship. Does the child have a physician that gets this population? Are they queer specific? Do they understand? Are they comfortable with talking about these things with these kids? Physicians, GPs, pediatricians are usually, to a fault, very comfortable talking about these things. We were raised, Ross and I, with very intact sensitivity and comfort with our bodies. Nudity was not sexualized in our house. We had the appropriate anatomical terms. We're very comfortable talking about sex in that way. If you're a physician and you're not like that, or the parent's not like that, and they're not comfortable talking about masturbation, but the kid's masturbating all the time, running around the house with the porn on the phone, we got to figure somebody that can communicate with them. So is that the doctor, the pediatrician, or whoever? We want to make sure we get them in those environments so they get some support there, because denial leads to STDs, STIs, and dangerous behavior. If we add the drugs and some of the other things that happen, if they're uncomfortable with who they are, then that, of course, only exacerbates it further. And drug culture and subpopulations of the queer nation, as well as general adolescence now, is pretty broad and robust. Educate encourage the families to educate themselves on the culture, as we talked about, and don't fence them in as just identified as that thing. All right, so there's some data here. High school support at home and high social support at home cuts the suicide risk in half. Open conversations with caring parents, communicate often. All these things are resiliency factors. Respect that it's a process, not a destination. Transgender are a whole lot different kind of discussion depending on their age and depending on what they're presenting and how they're presenting. Can be stabilized pretty quickly through adolescence if folks are handling it the right way. Versus authoritarian approaches, which always lead to usually rebellion and rejection of the parents' advice, because they can always turn to the computer or the phone and find the source with the lowest common denominator, accepting what they are presenting as. Be cognizant of pronouns. If pronouns are a confusion, which they are to cis in general people like me, use just the name or generic terms. Friend, guys sometimes. Pals, homies, chief, something fun. That was our college one for everybody when you forgot one of your fraternity brothers' names. What's up, chief? Who was that, Charlie, Joe? I don't know. And does everybody know what a dead name is? So dead names are kind of interesting in adolescence because that means that they're making a demarcation of who I am now versus who I was. Calling somebody by a dead name, if they are serious about it, can be very painful and damaging and traumatizing. It can be very confusing if it's transgender change, because not only am I grieving maybe this child is sexually different than I accept, they're gendered differently than I was anticipating, and then there's a new label to it. A big part of a parent that's going through that will need help in the grieving of that child. Literally, the boy is dead, let's say if it's boy to girl transition, if that occurs. And if it's in a system that the kid exacerbates it and continues to rebel in a space without protections, sometimes that can translate to a whole lot of self-hate too for them. And then again, watch for the bullying. All right, resources. We got the Trevor Project, PFLAG, also that I mentioned. There's a Gay Christian Network and Gay Straight Alliances in schools and college environments, and then there's a whole lot of others. I got a ton of books up here from the full range of the spectrum, how to convert your kid to accepting. There's one called Coming Out, Coming Home that I don't think I have a copy of. But if anybody wants these resources or the bibliography, I can get those to you. Whether if you're uninformed about transgender sexuality, there's a sex book that you may or may not want to share with your kid, but could be very educational for you, which is called Let's Talk About It. It's a gender-neutral sex ed book. And it is graphic with cartoon images of transgender bodies and gender-normative bodies and sexual stuff, potentially. But it's helpful if you want to understand that culture. There's also a series of books that I think is great for Christian families. By Stan and Brianna Jones. There's a 4-book series that you start when they're children about, God made my body and what he gave me, and then the progression all the way to the teen sex talk. It's a really good progression of helping kids understand the purpose of sexuality and so forth from a Christian normative standpoint. Anybody can think of any other resources? Ooh, up against the clock. Questions, thoughts? That was a fire hose.
Project Pride is a great resource. In
Pardon?
Project Pride.
Project Pride, okay. Feedback. That was a lot. Thank you. I really enjoyed teaching. Well, I really appreciate you. Sure, no other questions or thoughts? All right, keep me as a resource. I have cards up here. If you want to see these books, I'll be hanging out for a minute. I think the next session starts at 2:15.